image underscore 0.png / a high-altitude aerial photograph of the snow-covered Columbia Mountains in British Columbia, emphasizing deep valleys. Used for contrast / baseline in part 1. Image underscore 1.png / close-up of automated NRCN / ECCC snow monitoring stations on a bare, dry mountain slope, contrasting with image 0. Used for part 1 / 2 technical hook. Image underscore 2.png / satellite imagery showing the shrinking contours of Kinbasket Lake Reservoir behind the Mica Dam, exposing extensive dry lake beds. Used for part 2 infrastructure. Image underscore 3.png / a geological map of the Columbia Mountains highlighting deep-seated weakness zones and plate boundaries. Used for part 2 / 3 geophysical analysis. Image underscore 4.png / archival photo, 1920s or 1930s style, of a massive Canadian historical snow survey in the Rockies during the Great Drying Megadrought era. Used for part 3 historical parallel. Image underscore 5.png / night photo of Mica Dam illuminated with technical readouts overlaid, simulated, showing minimum power pool warnings and declining turbine activity. Used for part 4 impacts. Image underscore 6.png / photo of a Ktunaxa Nation member observing dusty early melt runoff on a bare field. Used for part 4 personal stories. Image underscore 7.png / wide shot of a helicopter lifting a large section of wind turbine blade near a hydroelectric station with low water. Image underscore 8.png / map visualizing coupled risks, snowpack decline, wildfire zones, and hydroelectric generation loss in Western Canada. It is April 2nd, 2026, 9:02 a.m. Right now, on the desks of senior hydrologists and disaster management teams across Western Canada, a catastrophic dataset is generating a singular, terrifying reality. The deep geophysical coupling of snowpack and rock that has sustained the nation's largest energy grid and agricultural core has severed. This is not a slow-moving climatic shift. It is happening in real time. The mountains that are supposed to be filling Western Canada's critical reservoirs right now are physically dry, and no one, from provincial capitals to the highest levels of the federal government, has agreed on what happens next. The numbers just verified are so unprecedented they defy existing engineering models. The critical Kootenay-Columbia snowpack, the hydrological engine for a basin supplying water to millions and vital power to the entire lower mainland and beyond, has physically vanished. What scientists saw in last week's raw telemetry data was confirmed yesterday, April 1st, by federal surveyors on the ground, changing everything we thought we knew about system resilience. This is the moment a structural water supply failure became an engineering and societal emergency. 130 automated monitoring stations, many with over half a century of continuous operation across the upper basin, are reading exactly 0.0% snow water equivalent. A number so fundamentally low it places 2026 not as a statistical outlier, but as a singularity, worse than every single drought year ever measured in Canadian history. The physical infrastructure is now responding. Kinbasket Lake, the massive reservoir behind the Mica Dam, dropped 1.1 meters in a single month, a rate of vertical loss that is hydrologically staggering. The reservoir is tracking directly toward the critical elevation, where its primary turbine intake must shut down for the first time in its history. This morning, restrictions on water use in major interior cities like Kelowna and Kamloops have been elevated to Stage 3. Mandatory closures of critical industrial water intakes are being discussed. In the Kootenay region, members of the Ktunaxa Nation have been forced to physically scale back planting on reservation land because there is simply not enough water in the rivers to grow food. And 7 major provincial and federal management entities that share responsibility for every drop in the system have already missed their critical federal deadline to agree on mandatory cuts. But here is the one detail that tells the true, terrifying scale of the collapse. An April Fool's joke that is actually a geophysical death sentence. On April 1st, the peak accumulation date, federal snow course surveyors fanned out to 64 manual measurement sites in the Columbia Mountains. These are locations with over 50 years of data. At 60 of the 64 sites, the reading was the lowest ever recorded. At 18 of those sites, the reading was 0. Not low snow. None. The critical apex snow course in the Selkirk Mountains had never been snowless on April 1st in its entire recorded history. Its previous minimum was 16.5 centimeters, measured during the catastrophic 1930s Great Drying Drought. This year, the surveyors found bare, dusty earth. The Environment and Climate Change Canada lead climatologist, Dr. Alistair McIntyre, said what no one, especially the operators of the massive hydroelectric dams, wanted to hear. It is now safe to conclude that this has been the worst year for snowpack accumulation in the Kootenay-Columbia Basin in recorded history, and potentially the entire Holocene, based on the physical indicators we are seeing. The water 40 million people in Western North America indirectly or directly rely on is vanishing faster than our models predicted. The clock is ticking toward the structural failure of the entire linked geological and infrastructural system. At 7:22 a.m. on February 14, 2026, a series of high-precision seismographs maintained by the Geological Survey of Canada near Golden, British Columbia, began recording a persistent low-frequency hum. This wasn't the jagged signature of a tectonic slip or a volcanic tremor. It was the sound of a mountain range physically unburdened. As the telemetry streamed into the Natural Resources Canada data center in Ottawa, analysts noted a corresponding signal from the GNSS array. The Purcell and Selkirk Mountains were experiencing a measurable vertical lift. Without the weight of a multi-billion-ton seasonal snowpack pressing down on the lithosphere, the crust was rebounding. The data showed a 14 mm upward offset across a 400-kilometer arc. In the cold language of geophysics, the mountains were floating higher because the water that should have been pinning them down simply wasn't there. To understand how we reached this point, we have to look at the atmospheric and terrestrial mechanics that dismantled the Canadian Cordillera's water bank in less than 90 days. The winter of 2025 to 2026 was defined by a persistent omega block, a high-pressure ridge that parted itself over the BC interior, diverting the atmospheric rivers that usually bury the peaks in 4 meters of snow. But it wasn't just the lack of precipitation. It was a dual-threat geophysical process, a massive thermal inversion combined with a catastrophic albedo collapse. In January 2026, the BC Ministry of Water, Land and Resource Stewardship's Dust on Snow program recorded a surge in particulate matter. Dust from the increasingly arid prairies and ash from the record-breaking 2025 wildfire season in the Okanagan had settled onto the high-altitude glaciers. When the February sun hit these darkened surfaces, the albedo, the reflectivity of the snow, dropped from a healthy 0.8 to a heat-absorbing 0.4. The snow didn't just melt, it sublimated and ran off into parched soils that acted like a sponge, preventing the water from ever reaching the stream gauges. By March, the NRCAN ground-penetrating radar units at the Illichilliwaite Glacier showed a terrifying internal structure. The snowpack was riddled with honeycomb voids, a sign of rapid isothermal warming where the entire depth of the snow reaches 0 degrees Celsius simultaneously. This is the structural failure of a water system. On March 12th, the federal runoff forecast for the Upper Columbia was revised downward for the sixth time in 6 weeks. The Bureau of Hydrology projected that the spring inflow to the Kinbasket Reservoir would be just 38% of the 1991 to 2020 median. This is the geological equivalent of a bank run. At the Mica Dam, one of the largest earthfill structures in the world, the engineering team is watching the piezometers, sensors that measure the hydrostatic pressure within the dam's core. As the water level in Kinbasket Lake drops toward the 730-meter mark, the pressure gradients are shifting in ways the dam's original 1970s design documents never anticipated. This is the minimum power pool, the point of no return. If the surface drops another 12 meters, the massive turbines, which provide roughly 35% of the province's peaking power, will begin to cavitate. Tiny bubbles of vacuum will form on the turbine blades, pitting the steel and threatening to tear the units apart from the inside. Dr. Elena Vasiliev, a senior geomorphologist at the University of British Columbia, described the situation in an emergency briefing to Public Safety Canada. We are observing a coupled system collapse. The mountains are dry, the permafrost layers and the high rock walls are thawing due to the lack of insulating snow, and the hydroclimatic link that stabilizes the entire Pacific Northwest power grid has snapped. We are no longer managing a resource. We are presiding over a structural liquidation. The timeline is now compressed. Every centimeter of drop in the reservoir represents the loss of megawatts that cannot be replaced. While the public looks at the bare peaks and sees a bad ski season, the engineers at the Geological Survey of Canada are looking at the pore pressure sensors and the GNSS lift data, realizing that the very foundation of Western Canada's water security is being rewritten by a winter that forgot to happen. At the current rate of decline, the Mica and Revelstoke dams will hit dead pool status, where water no longer flows through the intakes by gravity, before the first frost of 2026. The infrastructure is becoming a series of concrete tombstones in a dust-choked canyon. To find a precedent for the total hydrological collapse of 2026, historians and geoscientists look back to the Great Drying of the 1930s, a period that redefined the Canadian prairies. But even those catastrophic years, which turned the Pallisers Triangle into a dust bowl, pale in comparison to the vertical drought now strangling the British Columbia interior. According to tree-ring chronologies analyzed by the University of Victoria's tree-ring laboratory, the current deficit in the Upper Columbia Basin has no match in the last 1,200 years. This isn't just a weather event. It is the reactivation of a paleoclimatic cycle that our modern industrial infrastructure was never designed to withstand. The Geological Survey of Canada is now investigating a more sinister coupling, the link between the missing snowpack and crustal instability. In the Canadian Cordillera, the seasonal weight of the snow, estimated in a normal year to be upwards of 30 gigatons across the Columbia and Kootenay ranges, acts as a stabilizer for the complex web of faults crisscrossing the Rocky Mountain Trench. As that weight vanishes months ahead of schedule, the phenomenon of lithospheric unloading is no longer theoretical. On April 5, 2026, GSC sensors detected a swarm of microseismic events ranging from magnitude 1.8 to 2.4, concentrated precisely where the crustal rebound is most aggressive, near the Mica Dam. While these tremors are small, they signal a change in the pore pressure dynamics of the surrounding rock masses. Without the hydrostatic pressure of the snowpack and the subsequent slow infiltration of meltwater, the active layer of the high-altitude permafrost is exposed to rapid thermal cycling. In the Selkirk Mountains, Parks Canada geologists have reported a 400% increase in rock glacier movement. The ice that acts as the geological glue for these peaks is melting, and without the insulating blanket of a 3-meter snowpack, the deep-seated rock fractures are expanding. This creates the Elliott Creek scenario on a regional scale, referring to the 2020 landslide in the Coast Mountains, where a mountain slope collapsed into a glacial lake, triggering a 100-meter high tsunami. In 2026, the risk is that a similar mass wasting event could strike the half-empty Kin Basket or Revelstoke reservoirs, sending a displacement wave into the face of a dam already under structural stress from low water levels. The statistics provided by Environment and Climate Change Canada, ECCC, paint a grim picture of this cyclicity. Historically, the worst snow year on record for the BC interior was 1977, where the snow water equivalent, SWE, hit 55% of normal. In 2026, that number has plummeted to 14%. The return period for a year this dry is officially off the charts. Current ECCC models have stopped assigning a probability because the baseline has shifted so far into the tail of the distribution. Dr. Julian Vallet of the GSC Pacific Division notes that we are seeing a systemic decoupling of the hydrological cycle. Usually, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, PDO, provides some predictability, but the 2026 anomaly has overridden these cycles. The forecast models are failing because they rely on historical data that assumes the mountains will always hold a frozen reserve. But the twist that scientists are only now beginning to quantify is the feedback loop of the Bear Peak. When the mountains are white, they reflect 80% of the sun's energy back into space. Today, the exposed dark shale and granite of the Rockies are acting as giant radiators. This thermal energy is being transferred directly into the atmosphere, creating a localized heat dome that is further accelerating the evaporation of what little water remains in the high alpine tarns and creeks. It is a self-perpetuating cycle of desiccation. The GSC's GNSS network continues to record the Purcell Mountains rising, now at a rate of 4 mm per week. This isn't just the Earth breathing, it's a warning. The removal of the snowpack's mass is altering the stress state on the deep-seated thrust faults of the Western Cordillera. In a region where tectonic tension is already high, the sudden removal of billions of tons of water is a geophysical experiment we are performing in real time, with the lives and livelihoods of millions downstream as the variable. The infrastructure of the 20th century, built on the assumption of a stable snow-fed climate, is now a collection of stranded assets in a rapidly rising landscape. While the geophysical data paints a picture of systemic failure, the human cost is being tallied in real time across the valleys of British Columbia and the parched agricultural belts of the prairies. At the Mica generating station, 140 kilometers north of Revelstoke, senior turbine technician Arjun Singh stands on the gallery floor, feeling a vibration that shouldn't exist. He has worked for BC Hydro for 22 years, but the sound coming from Unit 5 is new. A hollow metallic grinding that echoes through the concrete heart of the dam. It is the sound of cavitation. With the reservoir level at an all-time low of 732 meters, the water pressure is insufficient to prevent vacuum bubbles from forming on the massive 400-ton runner. We are hearing the death rattle of the grid, Singh says into his radio. If we don't throttle back now, the imploding bubbles will pit the stainless steel like it's been hit by buckshot. We lose the unit, we lose the province's backup. At 11:15 a.m., the control room makes the call. 500 megawatts are scrapped from the provincial supply. In Vancouver, the ripple effect is immediate. Light rail transit systems in the lower mainland experience brownout stutters, and the heavy industrial smelters in Trail and Kitimat are told to prepare for mandatory load shedding. The crisis extends far beyond the concrete walls of the dams. In the Creston Valley, Sarah Desjardins, a land steward for the Ktunaxa Nation, walks across a section of the Kootenay River floodplain that should be underwater this time of year. Instead, the ground is a mosaic of cracked, sun-baked silt. She points to the remains of a traditional sturgeon spawning bed, now a graveyard of bleached shells and desiccated aquatic plants. Our elders speak of the hunger years, but they always spoke of the mountains as the great white storehouse, Desjardins explains, her voice tight with a mixture of grief and anger. The storehouse is empty. We are watching a 1,000-year-old ecological cycle end in a single season. The sturgeon, the salmon, they depend on the cold pulse of the melt. Without it, the water temperature in the shallows is already hitting 22 degrees Celsius in April. It's a thermal trap. The Ktunaxa have issued a formal declaration of emergency, noting that the lack of water has rendered their community gardens and traditional food sources non-viable, forcing a total reliance on expensive, trucked-in supplies from Alberta. A logistical nightmare as the mountain passes face their own threats. The economic shockwave is staggering. The Insurance Bureau of Canada, IBC, has released an initial estimate of 18.5 billion Canadian dollars in projected losses for the 2026 season alone. In Revelstoke and Golden, the ski industry, the lifeblood of the winter economy, collapsed 6 weeks early. Marcus Thorne, a veteran mountain guide, stands in a deserted parking lot at the base of a shuttered resort. Usually, we are worried about avalanches in April. This year, we are worried about sparks, Thorne says, gesturing toward the brown, tinder-dry forests that should be buried under 2 meters of snow. The resort's closed because there is no snow, but the guide stayed because we are waiting for the fires. The interface between the town and the forest is now a fuse. On April 8, Public Safety Canada issued the first evacuation alerts of the season for the outskirts of Nelson, an unprecedented 3 months ahead of the traditional fire season. The ground is so dry that the duff layer, the decaying organic matter on the forest floor, has become hydrophobic, meaning any localized rain simply bounces off, unable to penetrate the soil. The logistics of Western Canada are also fraying. Along the CPKC and CNR rail corridors through the Rogers Pass, engineers are monitoring the rails for sun kinks. Without the cooling effect of the mountain snowpack to regulate local ambient temperatures, the steel rails are expanding beyond their tolerances. A freight derailment near Field, British Columbia, on April 10th was attributed to track deformation caused by a record-breaking 28-degree day. The link between the Port of Vancouver and the rest of the country is now vulnerable to the very temperature of the air. As the sun sets over the bare peaks of the Purcells, the scale of the Stage 4 water restrictions becomes visible in the cities. In Kelowna, the Water Police, bylaw officers tasked with enforcing the ban on all outdoor water use, patrol neighborhoods where once lush lawns have turned to golden straw. The tension is palpable. Small-scale orchardists in the Okanagan, whose families have grown cherries and apples for generations, are facing a total crop loss. If the irrigation districts don't open the valves by May 1st, the trees will start to die, says orchardist David Friesen. You can't just turn an orchard back on next year. If the trees die, the farm is gone. He is one of thousands waiting for a federal-provincial water-sharing agreement that remains stalled in a jurisdictional deadlock. The 40 million people downstream of these mountains, stretching through the irrigation districts of the South Saskatchewan River and into the hydrogrids of the Pacific, are waiting for a miracle that the geophysics says isn't coming. The silence of the mountains is the loudest warning we've ever had. The October 1st deadline is no longer a date on a calendar. It is a point of structural collapse for the Canadian Federation. As the summer of 2026 wanes, the federal government, under the coordination of Public Safety Canada, is preparing for a move that has no peacetime precedent: the invocation of the Emergencies Act to seize control of interprovincial water flows. The water war between British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan is no longer a matter of policy. It is a struggle for physical survival. The 7-state deadlock of the South has its mirror here, as the provinces that share the ripples of the Rockies fail to agree on who takes the final, devastating cuts. But while the lawyers argue in Ottawa, the geophysics of the mountains have already moved on. The snow water equivalent, SWE, remains at zero, and the long-term forecast from Environment and Climate Change Canada, ECCC, suggests that the winter of 2026 to 2027 may offer no reprieve. We are entering the era of the permanent bare peak. At the Mica and Revelstoke dams, the engineering reality is grimmer than the public has been told. Internal memos from NR Khan describe a Deadpool scenario by early November. If the surface of Kinbasket Lake drops another 5 meters, the vortices created by the massive intake towers will begin to suck air into the penstocks. This isn't just a power outage, it is a catastrophic mechanical risk. The air pockets would cause water hammer effects, massive pressure surges that could rupture the high-pressure steel linings of the dam's internal arteries. To prevent this, the dams must be shut down entirely. For the first time since the 1970s, the battery of the West will go dark. The loss of 3,500 megawatts of firm baseload power will force a total re-evaluation of Western Canada's energy security. Plans are already being drafted to reactivate decommissioned gas plants and surge coal-fired generation in the prairies, but the transmission lines are already strained by the heat. The risk is spreading east, following the dry beds of the North and South Saskatchewan rivers. These rivers, which provide the lifeblood for Calgary, Edmonton, and Saskatoon, are fed by the same vanishing mountain snowpack and retreating glaciers. In Lake Diefenbaker, the water levels have dropped so low that the irrigation intakes for 300,000 acres of Saskatchewan farmland are now sitting a meter above the waterline. The breadbasket of the world is turning into a dust bowl in real time. Global commodity markets are already pricing in a 40% failure of the Canadian wheat and canola crops. This is a multi-billion-dollar hit to the national GDP, but the ecological cost is higher. The vapor pressure deficit, a measure of how thirsty the atmosphere is, has reached levels never before recorded in Canada. The air is physically pulling moisture out of the deep soil, killing the root systems of the boreal forest and the grasslands alike. This brings us to the most terrifying prospect of 2027, the megafire cycle. Without a snowpack to keep the high-altitude forests moist through June, the entire Cordillera has become a continuous field of cured tinder. Natural Resources Canada's FireSense satellite program has mapped extreme and catastrophic fuel loads across 80% of the BC interior. We are no longer looking at seasonal fires, we are looking at a landscape-scale transformation. If a lightning storm hits the Selkirks in this state, the resulting pyrocumulonimbus clouds could generate their own weather systems, creating fire tornadoes that move faster than any evacuation order. The vulnerability of our critical corridors, the Trans-Canada Highway and the dual rail lines, means that a single major fire in the Fraser Canyon or the Rogers Pass could effectively cut Western Canada in half, severing the link between the Port of Vancouver and the rest of the continent for months. The future we are stepping into is one of coupled risks. The missing snow leads to low water leads to power failure leads to economic paralysis, and the dry landscape leads to fire. It is a domino effect where every piece is a vital organ of the nation. Scientists at the Geological Survey of Canada are now monitoring the isostatic adjustment of the entire western platform. As the water mass vanishes, the crustal stress is redistributing. They are watching for triggered seismicity along the Cascadia subduction zone and the internal mountain faults. The removal of the weight of the water is a geological unpinning of the West. As we look toward the winter of 2026, the question is no longer when will the water return, but how do we live in a land that is drying out from the peaks down. The 0% reading at the Apex snow course wasn't a fluke, it was a transition. The infrastructure of Canada, the dams, the cities, the farms, was built on the promise of a predictable, frozen reservoir in the sky. That promise has been broken. The mountains are now bare, the reservoirs are falling, and the water that 40 million people depend on is not coming back. We are no longer waiting for the storm. We are living in the aftermath of its disappearance. Follow the data, because the data is the only map we have left in a landscape that no longer looks like Canada. The clock has run out. The era of the great drying has begun.